This is the Research Café series. This is the very first event. It's a series of events we'll be taking around the university over the foreseeable future. We've got a series of 4 eclectic topics today for us to contemplate and enjoy. And the idea is very much that this is a chance for people to network, talk to each other, and enjoy learning about what research activities members of staff in the university are engaged in. It's as simple as that, really. It's meant to be an intellectual stimulating event. So we have 4 speakers today, and so I've introduced the very first one. This is Jos Vanrenterghem from the School of Sports and Exercise Sciences, and he will be talking about why will I fall sooner with age. I think something that we'll all be interested in at some point in the future, hopefully in the distant future, but it's a very important topic. So if I hand over to Jos, and thank you very much for being the first one up on this series.
Thank you very much. Okay, there is no stress. I'll try to stick within 10 minutes, so I'll kick off straight away by telling that I will not answer that question. You will be very disappointed. What I, however, will do is report on something that I've had the chance to do because of an early career fellowship that I received from John Moores, to go to Australia, to Sydney, to work with Professor Stephen Lord, who's really a big name about fall prevention. They have an institute there which is called the Neuroscience Research Australia, and they focus on preventing falls and trying to see what you can do. And the focus of my work that I will present today is in a sense the work that has been done there. Now, why did I go there? First of all, I wanted to use neuro to get some benefits, and the benefits was to get some epidemiological tools. Here in our institute we don't have a lot of older adults. We still have an interest in looking at falls and falls prevention, but if you want to do large studies, how do you do that? How do you actually set something up like that, and what is the actual key factor that makes it possible? So that was my first reason. Second was then for neuro to benefit from me going there in some of the postural control knowledge that I have, because I have done some biomechanics related work which they don't necessarily have the skills and knowledge about. And then secondly, the tools that we have allow us to process some of the data that they also sometimes collect in epidemiological context in a much quicker fashion. So there was basically some benefits for both parties, and hopefully in the future that will lead to grant applications. And so I left off, and this is now the report of one study which is published in Gait and Posture, and it's got a very difficult title. But what you should focus on is, okay, if we have a certain risk of falling, we're getting older, that means we will increase our risk of falling, and I'll come back to that point of what that risk might be. Then potentially that is related to certain factors. You probably all have some factors in mind. Okay, I'm strong, I'm good in reacting to perturbations, I'm agile, but which actual factors do play a role there? And so that's the kind of work that we've done there, and we're focused on protective stepping. If you actually get perturbed, you have to step very often to make sure that you don't fall. So how do we do that, and is there anything that we know about that? The reason why you do that is to increase your base support, because if you don't take a step, your base support stays there, and actually what you want to do is make it larger. And it's crucial for avoiding a fall. Now, stepping often might be inappropriate or inefficient in older people. And why is that? Well, first of all, very often they will take earlier multiple steps, rather than a young person here who will take a step forwards when I push them from behind, and they'll take just one single step which is sufficient to maintain their balance. An older person will very often take one first step which is insufficient and then has to be followed up with multiple steps, which could lead to issues. Secondly, there's different strategies that they might use. They might use strategies, for example, in lateral pushes that are not necessarily very helpful for them. For example, a young subject, when you actually push them towards the right, you give them a push towards the right, what they will do is they will unload the limb that is initially loaded to immediately take a step lateral. This is beneficial because if you look at what older adults very often do, because their leg on that side, the ipsilateral leg gets loaded, they don't have the strength to actually lift it and move it. What they will do is they'll choose this leg that is unloaded, but the problem with that is you've got this other leg in the way if you want to take that step. So you have much more chances of falling actually, rather than taking the loaded leg. So people have looked at that, but what they've not looked at is certain aspects of what we call force-controlled perturbations. If you perturb someone, what people have done is they've taken a rope and they've just said, okay, right, I pull you from here to there. But what we now can do is we cannot do that. We can actually do a pull which is related to the force that we generated, which is the typical situation that you encounter in the world. Typically, you can resist a force. And so what we did is we had a rig which allowed us to pull on people with a certain force. And what we wanted to know is at which force is it that they have to take a step? What is the actual threshold that they have to take a step? And can we relate that to the actual physiological and cognitive function of those people, particularly in older adults? So what are the force thresholds? And are these thresholds related to physiological or cognitive capacity in people who potentially are at risk of falls? We had 242 independent living 80 years of age. Screening was done on physiological fall risk, which I'll explain, and stepping response to the pull. And then we had a follow-up, which was actually then asking for 12 months, every month, a falls diary. And so they had to basically write down, did they have a fall or not? Which is very handy because you can define falls as an unexpected event in which the participant comes to rest to the ground, floor or lower level. So those people who we consider fallers are people who had at least one fall that was either injurious or at least two that potentially were not non-injurious. So that's what we consider fallers. This is what we call a prospective approach. You have a retrospective approach where you look at people and try to identify their fall risk, but the prospective approach is you follow them up for 12 months and then you actually see who has fallen from that cohort. So we have two approaches to this in one study. The risk of falling is identified by a battery that is looking at proprioception, vision, reaction time, sway, and quad strength, and these kind of factors, and is put into what we call a overall falls risk score. This is a study by the group of Lord that is really recognized as one of the key studies in that, where they have come up with some sort of an algorithm to combine these individual measures into one score. And the score is basically the lower you are, the better. But as you can see, it is age dependent that you need to interpret that. So what you can see is that actually the blue band is the band that you are expected to be in your population in terms of your age. You see that after 60, it quite quickly goes up in terms of where normally you would expect to be. And so that kind of risk of falling is what we can assess through those individual measurements into one composite measure. The force-controlled pull rig is, I won't go into detail technically, but what you can see is actually basically if someone gets a pull from the right, for example, then you see that the person here, in this case, takes that crossover step. So it's a choice that you make, and we're going to look into what that means. First of all, we want to know how discriminant our data is. To do that, we compare young with old, because we expect quite dramatic differences there. And what we find is that young people have at least very much higher force thresholds than older people. This is what we kind of expected, so it's nothing unexpectedly, but it's something to indicate already for both anterior and lateral falls that the force thresholds in young people are higher than in older people. That is significant, which means that we have something that we can potentially use now to look within the older cohort what's going on. And so what we there found is that males had actually a certain higher capacity to withstand forces than females. This is the first thing, which kind of makes sense because we all do think that they tend to be stronger at the same age, so when you match them. Now, we have to be careful here. If you talk about force, if I'm very heavy and I apply a certain force to myself, if someone else who's very light gets the same force applied to them, then it's quite logical that they will have a lot less resistance, so they'll struggle more. So what we need to do is control this for body height and body weight, just to make sure that we don't make that mistake of considering forces across the board. The same thing applies with falls risk. So this is the retrospective or the cross-sectional approach that we have, where we can actually look at, okay, those people with a low falls risk from the composite measure compared to people with a high falls risk with that composite measure, how do they relate? And what we find is the people with a low falls risk can withstand higher forces. They have an ability to withstand higher forces. So now we've established that, my question is then, what's behind it? What is actually the cause? So what we do then is we then take a correlates analysis where we look for each direction whether within the older cohorts we could explain their force thresholds by certain measurements individually from that composite measure that we actually have measured, have assessed. And so what we find is that The actual force thresholds in anterior direction was explained by knee strength and their amount of sway when they just stand still. So it's a strength-related issue. Now, that's different for the posterior side, because the posterior side we see there's reaction time, not strength-related, but your ability to react quickly actually helps you to prevent having to step. And laterally, knee strength comes in, same as here, but also executive function, which is a measure for cognitive ability. So actually we need to be able to think there, which actually makes sense if you think about it. If I have to take my step to the right, I need to be able to make a conscious decision of actually using the leg, which when it feels unnatural to move because it's loaded, I need to lift that one to safely actually move towards the side. And so we can discriminate there for quite large percentages certain responses of those people. Then if we look at the prospective component, this is the next study actually, which is now in preparation, and we're about to submit that paper. Then we can actually see that there's only for the posterior direction, the force thresholds are actually explaining who will fall in the future. So it's only based on pulling someone from behind that we can actually explain whether they will fall or not, whether they actually become fallers or not, which is very valuable because the tests that people use in clinic at the moment, which a GP uses to test if someone has good balance, is actually stand behind the patient and pull them on their shoulders backwards and see how they respond. And if they actually take a step, then it's good. If they don't take a step and literally fall into the arms of the GP, then the GP knows there's a big problem. Well, that's a very crude measure, but which is already in clinical practice, and we can confirm here that actually that's the direction we need to go. We need to go towards posterior pulling forces. That's what the conclusion is on that. So overall, balance, strength and agility can explain to a certain extent your ability to respond forceful pulls, but also cognitive function is a very important one, particularly for lateral falls, which are considered quite important, which a lot of people would forget that actually by making sure your brain works well, you can better respond to physical demands in daily life. And then that equals a sufficient and appropriate response. So not only the ability to step large enough, but also the ability to take the right choice in terms of lateral, for example, going the right leg. Final conclusion, what is the future? More prospective studies will probably be needed, but now we know that if we do a paradigm, we would probably focus on the actual posterior pulse, because that seems to have most future in it. And these kind of studies can actually support interventions better in terms of when we intervene, try to train someone to improve their posterior pull responses rather than actually focusing on all of them. That might be beneficial. What is Jos's future? Well, Jos's future is actually now a new fight against the epidemiology biomechanics paradox. And that paradox is to do with sample sizes. I have a big problem here. In biomechanics, we are used to measure very small sample sizes because our equipment is typically very complex. And if you ever want to know about that, come and visit our labs and I can show you how complex it is. The problem is that if you have such complex measures, it takes a long time to collect data and a long time to actually process data. And that's why I have a paradox, because in epidemiological studies, when I was working in Australia, it was great. Statistical power was up through the roof. It was fantastic, whereas we always work with 15, 20 subjects and struggle with that. So that's my paradox I have to fight now. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions? I'll open with one first, if I may. What can individuals do, if anything, in terms of their own conditioning, in terms of improving their responsiveness or minimising the risk of fall? You mentioned things like knee strength as an important parameter. Mm-hmm. Exercise obviously is good as you're getting into older age, which a study came out just a couple of days ago showing broader benefits of that with dementia and all sorts. So are there things we can do as we get older?
Stay fit.
Just stay fit.
The problem is that that's going against the tendency of what your body wants to do. At the age of 65, your risk of falling dramatically increases. And that increase is because of typically habits in life that will change with that age. And so in the sense of what can you do, stay fit. And it doesn't have to be much as the paper exactly told.
Yeah.
Just to walk on a regular basis is more than sufficient. And that's what we tend to see with the people that come in there. Those that walked to the center tended to be the ones that had a very low falls risk, because that was their habit. They would walk everywhere, compared to those that had to be actually brought by taxi or something, and not necessarily because they couldn't do it, because there could be reasons why they couldn't do it, but just because it was their habit. Those would be the ones that had higher risk.
That's a simple message then, I think, for us all, unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Are there any other questions?
Looking at it from a social scientific perspective,
Yeah.
is your research purely observational and quantitative, or do you look into qualitative responses to strategy and consequences?
Yeah. In this case, it is quantitative. It's all quantitative. That's their forte, to actually quantify things and deliver it to epidemiologists. That's what this institute's strength is. I can see definitely scope for qualitative work, because one thing that I figured out when I was actually weeding my way through their databases of all these parameters was that there was a lot of information every time lacking about some backgrounds that we should know. Now, this work that they do is based on the back of a grant with social scientists and neurocognitive scientists, which have a tendency to go towards more qualitative parameters as well. And so in that sense, I think they will probably have to go stronger in their collaboration as a unit to actually address it from both sides, not only quantitative, because the problem that you have is that of any of these humans there is no stereotype. Of any of these 240 individuals, there is not a single stereotype. They all have their unique asset of parameters and contexts, which if you were to look into that, you would probably start to see a very strong pattern in a certain direction. But based on quantitative data like this, it's very hard to reveal those.
It raises a really important point, which is about the need for interdisciplinary approaches.
Yeah.
But not just epidemiology and biomechanics, but also taking account fear of falling, and particularly in older women where they know that bone densities perhaps reduce, and therefore there's a more serious consequence. And all the research councils now identify ageing as a cross council priority, and it is in Europe as well. And so there's an awful lot of money being thrown at this, and it comes up with novel approaches, and this is where the qualitative approach can add real value to in-depth quantitative studies. So I think there's real opportunities there to explore that.
There was another question.
Anything else?
I think it's just two questions. I was wondering, do you find in studies of falling, do people in their everyday lives encounter posterior fall more than lateral and things like that? But also, if you've got somebody with a fear of falling, that means maybe their overall fitness is going to decrease because they're less likely to want to get mobile. So would something like an intervention focusing on knee strengthening be helpful, or do you think that's too much of a quick fix?
Yeah. Right. First question. It's difficult to get a good answer on what is exactly the most common fall. The thing is that every researcher who writes their paper on a specific direction of falling or whatever, they'll argue that their fall is the most important one. So they'll say, the most common one to break hips is actually lateral fall, which is true. In terms of people break their hips most commonly actually when they have a lateral fall. But that doesn't mean that that's the most common fall. So I don't think there's already a lot of evidence in terms of which direction people would fall and which direction people would be pushed, or etc. What this work seems to confirm is that actually people seem to struggle most with posteriorly directed perturbations to their body. So not necessarily saying that that's the most common fall. In terms of your second question, there's actually an interesting anecdotal evidence about this. This particular study is part of a second wave of these kind of cohorts that come in. So they have their first wave, which was 500 people actually that they had come in, and then they had a second one of 500 people, of which they managed to collect data of 250, half of it, for these kind of perturbations. Because as you can see, it's quite a lot of work to be done with the people, and not everyone would necessarily be prepared. Now, what we found when we analyzed this second wave, there was already an effect of intervention that we seem to notice compared to the first wave, which is not because these people have had an intervention, but because somehow this institute is in Sydney, the whole area of Sydney and around, is become really well known. And people probably in that environment over the time course after that first wave have probably already become much more aware about falls and the risk of falling and everything. So actually the predictor that they had established beforehand in the earlier waves, which seemed to work all the time very well in this composite measure to predict falls risk, actually didn't work well on this wave. So it's actually showed already an effect just purely on probably people, their demographics, the fact that they were exposed already to the fact that this was about fall risk and that they might be thinking of it. So that in itself we thought was already a potential intervention that was beneficial to them, which in a sense is good, but it wasn't very good for this wave because obviously you want to have people who are not intervened with yet. So if that's an anecdotal evidence towards the potential impact of interventions on this whole behavior, that would be one. Knee strength is definitely one to work on, we would say. Because it will help with many other things than fall prevention as well. It keeps you ambulatory in terms of walking upstairs. You need the knee strength to walk upstairs and even more to walk downstairs without falling. So if anything is a danger of sarcopenia, it's the quads. You need to be able to support yourself, and so in that sense I would say if there is a shortage of knee strength, then you'd have to work on it. Very hard with older people, but still what we seem to see in certain studies is that some interventions where they actually have people just in a group session doing stand up and sitting down exercises seems to already benefit. Why? It's hard to know if it's exactly because of that exercise or if it's because of the awareness that they get through that exercise about falls risks. Yeah?
All right, thank you very much indeed, Jos. Thank you.
Okay.